es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, the Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre el liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo del público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de estos objetivos. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral. Que el cierre de brechas, que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces, nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico que requieren nuestras empobrecidas economías en tiempos de COVID.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Present, Mr. Chairman, are Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Bolivia, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, the United States, Grenada, Guatemala, Jamaica, Mexico, Panama, Peru, the Dominican Republic, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, Uruguay, and Venezuela. We have quorum, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Prince. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. I have the honor to declare open this special meeting of the Permanent Council pursuant to Article 14 of the Statutes of the Permanent Council and Article 37 of its Rules of Procedure. The meeting was convened at the request of the Permanent Missions of Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda, with the co-sponsorship of the Permanent Missions of Barbados, Belize, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Grenada, Guyana, the Dominican Republic, and the United States, as contained in document CP-INF 9290-22 Rev 1, with a view to considering the situation in Ukraine. In accordance with Article 43 of the Rules of Procedure of the Permanent Council, we will proceed to adopt the order of business for this meeting. Document CP-OD-2365/22. There being no further observations or concerns, the order of business is hereby approved. We shall now proceed to the second item on the order of business, which is to consider the situation in Ukraine as requested by the Permanent Missions of Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda, with the co-sponsorship of the permanent missions of Barbados, Belize, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Grenada, Guyana, the Dominican Republic, and the United States. As I offer the delegations the floor, I would like to first offer it to the permanent representative of Guatemala to present the declaration entitled The Situation in Ukraine. Ambassador Claveri, you have the floor, Madam.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greetings to the Secretary General, Luis Almagro, the Assistant Secretary General, Nestor Mendez, and to all the representatives of member states and permanent observers of this organization. My delegation is very grateful for this very rapid response on the part of the chair to convene this special session that my country has requested alongside Antigua and Barbuda and the member states that have accompanied us, to consider the deep consternation of the international community at the invasion of Russian armed forces into sovereign territory of Ukraine, which is an observer of this organization. The Republic of Guatemala joins the general condemnation that this invasion has occasioned, threatening as it does the life of hundreds of thousands of people of the region as well as international peace and security. This is why we echo here the points made by the Secretary General of the United Nations and express our solidarity to the people of Ukraine facing the Russian military attack, exhorting all parties to consider their obligations as well as human rights. Guatemala appeals to diplomatic forces to assist everyone to move to a downing of arms and exhort Russia to seek a peaceful solution to this conflict and to a withdrawal of its troops. Thank you. While it is most regrettable to have to speak of this terrible crisis, we echo what the Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the United Nations said, and I quote, that it is yet time to put a stop to this and to avoid hundreds and thousands of people to die in the struggle. We also echo the appeal made by the Secretary General of this organization, Don Luis Almagro, who calls for an immediate ceasefire of this situation. All members and permanent observers of this organization rise up for peace and security at the international level, to make use of peaceful means to proceed on the basis of international law and in recognition of the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine. Let me proceed then, if I may, Chair, to read out the declaration entitled The Situation in Ukraine, which is presented by 20 members of this organization: Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Canada, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, and the United States to the Organization of American States, including also Mexico, Panama, Peru, the Dominican Republic, as I've said, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Venezuela. Thank you, sir. If I may, I will now proceed to read out the declaration. The situation in Ukraine. the permanent missions of Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Canada, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, and the United States to the Organization of American States, along with Mexico, Paraguay, the Dominican Republic, Suriname, Trinidad and Tobago, and Venezuela, all members of the Organization of American States, committed to the Charter of the Organization of American States, which was established to achieve an order of peace and justice, promote solidarity, strengthen collaboration, and defend sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, reaffirming that international law is the rule of conduct of states in their mutual relations, that the international order consists essentially of respect for the personality, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of states, and the faithful fulfillment of the obligations derived from treaties and other sources of international law, and that good faith must govern the relations of states with each other. Also reaffirming the shared values and common approaches contained in the Declaration on Security in the Americas, 2003, and that peace is a value and a principle in itself and is based on democracy, justice, respect for human rights, solidarity, security, and respect for international law, emphasizing that the security of the hemisphere is affected by threats to global peace and security, and that a stable and secure hemisphere constitutes an essential component of world peace and security. Reiterating that the hemisphere states have an important role to play in promoting international peace and stability, especially through respect for international law and support for bilateral, regional, and multilateral regimes, as well as other agreements, and for negotiations, mechanisms, activities, and security processes within the framework of the United Nations. Recalling the list of confidence and security building measures, CSBMs, approved by the Committee on Hemispheric Security on March 12, 2020, to exchange and share experiences and ideas on transparency and the CSBMs themselves with other regional and sub-regional security forums, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Taking note of the declarations of the Secretary General of the United Nations calling for a peaceful solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, and that the solution be reached in accordance with the Minsk agreements endorsed by the United Nations Security Council in Resolution 2202 of 2015. Taking note of the statements made by the international community in relation to these events, recalling Resolution CP-Res 577 of April 1st, 1992, through which the Permanent Council granted the government of the Russian Federation the status of permanent observer to the organization, and Resolution CP-Res 629 of May 9th, 1994, through which the Permanent Council granted the government of Ukraine the status of permanent observer to the organization, and Resolution CP-Res 52, 61/72, which established that the purpose of permanent observers to the OAS is to promote cooperative relations among states from both the Americas and elsewhere that participate in the organization's programs. Greatly alarmed at the Russian Federation's unlawful, unjustified, and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, its continued violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity by military attacks on several of its cities, and its earlier unlawful and provocative decision to recognize the independence of certain areas of Ukraine, and recognizing with great concern that the world is now facing a crisis and that more death, destruction, and displacement will result from the aggressive actions of the Russian Federation. The states declare that they strongly condemn the unlawful, unjustified, and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation and call for the immediate withdrawal of the military presence and the cessation of any further military actions in that country. Point 2. The Russian Federation must immediately cease its hostilities, de-escalate, withdraw all its forces and equipment from Ukraine, and return to a path of dialogue and diplomacy for the solution of controversies. 3. Resolutely condemn the illegal recognition by the Russian Federation of the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, which represents a violation of the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine. 4. The Russian Federation's military operation in Ukraine is condemned as being counter to the principles of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as the prohibition on the threat or use of force and the peaceful resolution of disputes, which are enshrined in international law and in the Charter of the United Nations. They reiterate the importance of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and of respect for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. 6. They call out on parties to respect the human rights of the population, particularly as regards the promotion of the civilian population and those who are not actors in these hostilities. The expectation that all parties will respect the human rights of the population and remain permanently vigilant as they safeguard the population, civilians, and civilian property in the Ukraine in accordance with international humanitarian law. Thank you.
The floor is now open for participation by the member states. Requesting to speak is Saron Sanders, Antigua and Barbuda. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my delegation thanks you for accommodating this special meeting. And we thank the other 19 countries that have joined Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda in co-sponsoring this urgent declaration. Antigua and Barbuda is a co-sponsor of this declaration for very many good reasons. Not least among those reasons is that what we have witnessed are violations of international law and the Charter of the United Nations by the Russian Federation. Ukraine has been an independent state since 1991, with clearly defined borders. This unlawful and unprovoked incursion into Ukraine violates the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, the Charter of this organization of the American States, global peace and security. Mr. Chairman, small and militarily powerless states such as yours and mine depend upon adherence and respect to the agreed and settled principles that are set out in the UN Charter and in international law. When these principles are flouted and international law is violated, small states are obliged to speak out loudly in our own interest, as much as in the interest of nations that are the actual victims of aggression. My government recognizes that the government of the Russian Federation believes that the security of Russia is threatened. In this connection, we hold the view that the government of the Russian Federation has every right to voice its fears and concerns and to seek convincing assurances and mechanisms concerning its security in a peaceful manner. But as the international community has made clear in the United Nations and in many regional organizations, including the Caribbean Community CARICOM, seeking resolution by military aggression and violations of international law are not and cannot be acceptable, and they must be fully rejected. Mr. Chairman, the government of Antigua and Barbuda has made it clear in other fora that sovereignty, territorial integrity, self-determination, and the pacific resolution of disputes are the bedrock of international relations, and that these principles must be upheld everywhere. I reiterate that position today, particularly because Antigua and Barbuda, along with the rest of the global community, will pay a very high price for Russia's violations of these principles of international law. We feel we have every right to be concerned. Our region, the Caribbean, whose economies are still reeling from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, will not be immune from the negative impact on the global economy that is already obvious because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. As every region of the world, the Caribbean will experience harmful effects. No sector of any of our economies will be spared. We expect increases in the costs of oil and gas, and shortages and high costs of food. Especially affected will be our tourism industry, which is already under siege from the harmful effects of climate change and from the COVID-19 pandemic. As the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, stated in the meeting of the UN General Assembly on Ukraine just a couple of days ago, this conflict can trigger for all humanity a scale and severity of need unseen for many years. Mr. Chairman, while our small states in the Caribbean are strong in their national cohesion, they are militarily powerless against larger and powerful states. In this context, Russian attempts to annex parts of Ukraine by recognizing breakaway regions would have grave repercussions for our region and other regions around the world by emboldening other governments which claim the territory of their neighbors to act in a similar fashion. Antigua and Barbuda fears that the consequence of this would be to create hostilities and instability in almost every region of the world. My delegation laments the loss of life, displacement, and human suffering inflicted on innocent civilians in Ukraine. This must end, Mr. Chairman. It must end in the name of humanity. Antigua and Barbuda reaffirms its adherence to the fundamental principles of international law, and we join all peace-loving countries in calling for an immediate cessation of Russian aggression in the Ukraine. Mr. Chairman, This Permanent Council could not sit muted in the face of an unprovoked aggression by one of its permanent observer missions against another permanent observer mission, especially as the member states of this organization are each guided by Article 3 of the OAS Charter, which states clearly that the American states condemn war of aggression. We urge a return to multilateralism and to diplomacy that will leave Ukrainian territory and its borders intact, while assuring all parties, including the Russian Federation, of their security. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
You're most welcome, sir. Next, we have Ambassador Fiallo from the Dominican Republic. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, the Dominican Republic wishes to appreciate your convening this meeting and at the same time to speak out in this multilateral forum as we have done elsewhere, reiterating our inalienable support for the rule of law, for the freedom of peoples, for peaceful coexistence amongst nations and solidarity among the same. Our foreign policy has always worked to carry out the peaceful solution of controversies and the buttressing of international order and a respect for the principles that have given so much to humanity: peace, prosperity, and progress. The situation in Ukraine represents very grave threats to international order and peace. As the observers here that have led to the unjustified incursion of Russia in these last days with regard to Donetsk and Luhansk, we call out on a renewed commitment to abstain from having recourse to threat, to peaceful solutions, and to the upholding of the non-intervention in other states. This invasion must be roundly condemned by all of us collectively, as it has been by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and certainly by us here. Mr. Chairman, we know very well that amidst the immediate effect here will not only be death and destruction, but also the forced displacement of so many, the disturbance of markets, great economic loss, particularly in the energy section, and the chain of supplies in the food chain as in others. We are on the brink of very, very grave problems and dangers here. We're already in such a difficult situation as we try to emerge from this pandemic. This situation is something that risks plunging us back into very dark days. This Permanent Council of the Organization of American States, nonetheless, has the opportunity here to express unity, solidarity, and integration. The move to search resolutely for solutions to the crisis, and we send out the unequivocal defense of our commitment to fight for these. That is why, in light of all these principles, my country calls out for the search of diplomatic solutions. We call out for a ceasing of aggression and the revoking of these recent independence movements, a return to the Minsk Declaration, and a withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine, or any further actions that can only give rise to further violence, as we said in recent days at the General Assembly of the United Nations. We do not accept that the Ukraine has been divided, and we certainly don't accept the means by which this is being carried out. There will be no winner here, only losers in this kind of operation. And it doesn't matter whether a country is big or small. This is a basic principle. Thank you.
Next, we have Ecuador. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ecuador, alongside other countries, about 20 of them, have asked for this special meeting to be called of the Permanent Council in order to review the very serious situation in Ukraine, which has been victim of an armed attack affecting peace, international stability, and therefore our hemisphere, with an open violation of international law. And at this time, we need to come back to the fact that this is important to see as the behavior that affects all countries, no matter what the angle is. Ecuador, with its history of peace, spoke at the UN alongside other, mostly all countries of the UN who love peace, and called for a reduction in tension, which has gone unheeded. As a matter of fact, there was one delegation that turned away from the table in order to go down a more violent path. The Russian Federation decided to launch a military operation that violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. This is in the 21st century, when we believed that the military past and past of war in Europe had been part of past history. This all goes against the Charter of the United Nations and peaceful coexistence, and this has to do with the peaceful settlement of disputes and the threat of use of force in international relations, which have been violated. Ecuador adheres to and supports and sponsors the declaration that we have been negotiating, and which firmly rejects the unlawful, unjustified, and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, and also asks for the immediate withdrawal of the military presence and the cessation of any further military action. This conflict is one that my country knows all too well. President Guillermo Lasso and the foreign minister said as well that we have over 700 of our fellow nationals in Ukraine, most of them students. It is one of the largest Latin American communities in the country. Our commitment is to ensure that they come back safe and sound to our country, for which we appreciate all of the support we have gotten from our friendly nations in the area. We demand respect for the life, security, and physical integrity of Ecuadorians in the zones of conflict, based on international law and humanitarian law. And this demand is based on the fact that there needs to be ongoing protection and safeguard of civilians. That includes those who are in Ukraine, as we have highlighted in the declaration that we have before us today. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we have the Ambassador Ordonez. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My delegation endorses this declaration as read by the Ambassador of Guatemala, and also expresses our solidarity with the people and government of Ukraine during these very dark times. First and foremost, I would like to reiterate the message delivered by President Ivan Duque yesterday. He said, Colombia categorically rejects the assault on the people of Ukraine by Russia. Similarly, Colombia rejects the recognition, which is divorced from international law, from the Russian Federation for the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. My country, fully understanding its history, expresses our deepest and most profound concern given the violation in this assault, which is against the basic principles of international law. In particular, this is the prohibition of threats of or use of force against territorial integrity. or against the political independence of any country. Colombia also warns that full respect to the principle of peaceful dispute settlement is the only way to safeguard what is most precious to us, which is life and human dignity. We cannot forget that these principles are also the bedrock of the international system, as we have seen in our very own charter at the OAS. And this is why the countries in the hemisphere cannot remain silent when before us evolves a situation that could destabilize not only one region, but also the entire international system and bring about serious consequences, such as the complete disappearance of peace and human blight and massive displacements and other impacts that could also affect the recovery of the economic system around the world. Mr. Chairman, Colombia joins the echo of voices from the international community, all calling on Russia to respect human rights and to cease hostilities and withdraw all troops from Ukraine in order to reinstate its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We go next to Costa Rica. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, permanent representatives, alternate representatives, observers, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General. Costa Rica rejects any unilateral act of force against any state. Today, we have been called to this special meeting and are severely concerned and dismayed by what we've seen Russia do against Ukraine. This is an offensive that runs counter to the letter and spirit of the Charter of the United Nations, to which both nations are party, as well as the resolutions from the General Assembly of the United Nations, as well as multilateral agreements. And this represents a serious threat to peace and security around the globe, and also deprives us of the opportunity that is offered by multilateral platforms in order to reach agreements. Costa Rica condemns the use of force and the violation of territorial sovereignty and integrity in Ukraine, and condemns the violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation. We reiterate what we have heard from our own delegation in the United Nations. And first, that is that we must accept that in order to legitimize collective security, there needs to be respect for international law. Secondly, that aggression violates sovereignty and territorial integrity in Ukraine, as well as the Budapest Memorandum, which made it possible to remove the nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And this runs counter to international non-proliferation law. Third, all potential diplomatic avenues must be explored in order to prevent the humanitarian tragedy that would come from what is happening and unfolding in Ukraine. This is why we are calling for renewed dialogue and negotiations, and remind everyone that at this time, what are at threat are the lives of millions of people. These are men, women, children. Currently, in these exceptional times and times of economic uncertainty, it is important for countries to not continue to be battered by the consequences of this conflict. Hostilities must cease at once, and there needs to be a reassurance that civilians also be protected. Costa Rica is a disarmed country and true to its pacifist nature and adheres to multilateralism. We believe that peace is the only way, and it is how people should govern countries. The United Nations continues to pursue peace, supported by different mechanisms and regional mechanisms, as catalysts for dialogue and negotiation in order to find a solution to the conflict. Mr. Chairman, as stated, Costa Rica supports the declaration, the situation in Ukraine, as read by the delegation of Guatemala. And we remind everyone that the path towards building peace is and should be paved with initiatives that focus on people. Now more than ever, these initiatives must also be geared towards gender inclusion, particularly when women have been on the front lines calling for the cease of fight and combats, and also have contributed to building peace. Peace can only be lasting if it is inclusive and diverse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, we turn to the representative for Grenada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope I'm being heard. It says my internet is unstable. I greet you. I greet our Secretary General and our Assistant Secretary General, colleague ambassadors, alternate representatives as well. This is indeed a sad occasion, but it is one that gives us the opportunity to rally around the people of Ukraine, and we are in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Chair, I want to thank the delegations of Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda for bringing this to the fore, and of course Grenada is a co-sponsor of the declaration for us. For all the reasons that are listed in the declaration, we are in support, but I also want to read into the record of this forum the statement by the government of Grenada on the situation in Ukraine. Grenada expressly condemns Russia's assault on the people of Ukraine, which is contrary to the provisions of international peace and stability enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Grenada therefore calls for an immediate end to the hostilities. The long history of diplomatic engagement among countries provides adequate tools for the settlements of dispute without having to resort to violence, which hurts the very people who give leaders legitimacy in office. We therefore encourage diplomatic engagement to de-escalate existing tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Grenada reaffirms its commitment to the United Nations principle of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, and believes that the universal respect and adherence to these norms and principles of international law are fundamental to the maintenance of the international system and global peace and security. I thank you, Chair.
You're very welcome. Next, we have the Ambassador for Canada. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to start this afternoon by thanking the delegations of Guatemala and of Antigua and Barbuda for doing so much to make sure that we had this session this afternoon, and also to thank you for allowing this session to go ahead. As other colleagues have said, this is an important meeting for us to have. Canada strongly condemns Russia's unjustifiable and hostile attack on Ukraine and its earlier decision this week to recognize the independence of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. Mr. Chair, these attacks are causing widespread hardship in Ukraine and resulting in the senseless deaths of innocent lives. This is not just an attack on Ukraine. This is an attack on the UN Charter and the principles enshrined therein. Beyond these bedrock principles, we must never forget that war is an attack on humanity itself. Millions now live in fear. Thousands have fled, abandoning their livelihoods, abandoning their families, abandoning their homes. Hundreds have been killed, either as innocent civilians or for protecting their homeland. Mr. Chair, I'll continue in French. Nous avons entendu les remarques du président.
We've listened to President Putin's remarks. And now the entire world has witnessed his actions. He rejects Ukraine and says that the attack is legitimate and also rejects the choices made by the people of Ukraine about their own destiny. These irresponsible actions by Russia will have repercussions that will go far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The international community must come together and in one voice condemned these aggressive actions. Together, even within this Organization of American States, we must hold Russia accountable and ask for a change of course immediately. With our partners, Canada has imposed severe and significant sanctions against Russia, and if Russia continues to ramp up its efforts, we will react accordingly.
Canada will continue to support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and we will continue to show our solidarity with its brave and resilient people. We strongly urge Russia to abandon this path of war and return to diplomacy. As a permanent observer, Russia must respect the principles at the core of this organization, those of international law, of human rights, of democracy, of respect for sovereignty, and the rejection of wars of aggression. We must not stand idly by while Russia makes a mockery of all that we hold dear in this organization and the United Nations. An independent Ukraine, free to chart its own path and to forge its own identity, is the right of every Ukrainian. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have the ambassador from Mexico. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mexico strongly condemns the invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine and demands that military operations cease and for there to be respect of territorial integrity and for there to be protection of civilians and to prevent suffering and find a diplomatic way out of this situation. This has been a flagrant violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, and is also an aggression under Resolution 3314 of the General Assembly of the UN. Mexico knows all too well the pains that have marked our history. We had 4 foreign invasions, 2 by France in 1838 and 1862, and 2 by the United States in 1846 and 1914. In one of these, Mexico lost half of its land. Given our creation as a nation, our history, and our tradition, we reject and emphatically condemn any invasion by one country of another. We always find that we need to condemn all acts of aggression, as we have stated for the record as part of the League of Nations, given Ethiopia and Albania and Italy's aggression in 1935, as well as Austria by Germany in 1938. We reject the use of force, and it was driven by this that we called for the Inter-American Conference on Problems of Peace and War in Mexico City, known as the Conference of Chapultepec, which allowed for building a defined regional position to participate in the San Francisco Conference in 1945. Mexico has promoted peace and security, as seen in our leadership, to ensure that our region can be free of nuclear weapons. Through the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco. The situation that brings us together today shows us that non-intervention and respect for the sovereignty of countries are principles that still apply within international law. They do not expire, and they are not subject to conditions. Mexico continues to play a key role in the international community because we adhere to these principles in our foreign policy. Mexico has always opposed the use or the threat of use of force in international relations and firmly believes in seeking peaceful solutions for disputes and non-interference in the affairs of other states and in protecting human rights. And we will continue to ensure that these rights are respected in international organizations. This is why we also make sure that these are fully felt and lived at the OAS without any political exploitation and respecting the legal equality of countries. Mexico will not cease its call for diplomacy, for dialogue, and for respect and adherence to international law in international relations as the only way to address this threat. In order to do that, we're going to continue to act responsibly and actively as a non-permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Ambassador Roquebert. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, the government of my country believes that international law needs to be adhered to, and we condemn any violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine by Russia. Panama knows the consequences of these actions. This is why we call for immediate ceasing of hostilities and for the return to dialogue and diplomacy. This is the only way to ensure the well-being and protection of civilians and the most vulnerable in this conflict. Once again, peace and respecting the Charter of the UN and international law should be respected. Thank you.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we have Trinidad and Tobago. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, having joined the presenting delegations of Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda, and the other co-sponsoring delegations of this declaration, the delegation of Trinidad and Tobago expresses its dismay at the attack launched by Russia on Ukraine, and we declare our solidarity with the government and people of Ukraine amidst the destruction and the deterioration of the situation in Ukraine. Trinidad and Tobago condemns the outbreak of violence against Ukraine and reaffirms its commitment to the territorial integrity of sovereign states. Notwithstanding the intensified attacks on Ukraine, Trinidad and Tobago calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a reversion to dialogue and diplomacy as the only acceptable solution to this crisis. Trinidad and Tobago reiterates the call by the member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, for all actors to intensify diplomatic efforts to settle differences peacefully. Together with the member states of the CARICOM, Trinidad and Tobago regards the hostilities against Ukraine as violations of the principles of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference in the internal affairs of another sovereign state, and the prohibition on the threat or use of force and the peaceful resolution of disputes. In expressing our deep concern, Trinidad and Tobago is also mindful that the member states and permanent observers of this organization, including Russia and Ukraine, subscribe to these principles in accordance with the provisions of the charters of the Organization of American States and the United Nations. Trinidad and Tobago recognizes that the universal respect and adherence to these norms and principles of international law are fundamental to the maintenance of the international system and global peace and security. As a small island developing state, Trinidad and Tobago relies on the integrity of this rules-based international system to enable its citizens to pursue peacefully their rights and freedoms as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, Trinidad and Tobago has therefore been able to promote these aspirations of all people by the collective commitment of the member states of this organization to preserving the Americas as a zone of peace. However, this attack by Russia on its smaller and less powerful neighbor, Ukraine, is a reminder that we cannot take our liberty and our sovereign equality for granted. In the same manner that our people are deprived of their liberty and freedom by the arbitrary and unlawful use of force and power, our sovereign equality is disregarded, particularly for smaller and less powerful member states, when not preserved by the respect for equity or justice among the members of the international community. Without equity and justice among all member states, there will be no peace. Trinidad and Tobago is concerned that Russia's attack on Ukraine threatens global peace. Trinidad and Tobago emphasizes the need for a resolution that minimizes the loss of and the disruption to human life, and reiterates the call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a reversion to dialogue and diplomacy as the only acceptable solution to this crisis. I thank you, Chair.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we go to Ambassador Forsyth. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, I wish to both thank and commend the countries who were the first to present this initiative. My country agrees with these steps and hear from our foreign ministry, this historic ministry. I must say that it is a great honor to be part of such an important initiative in the history of our organization. Mr. Chairman, Peru strongly condemns the invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine. In that regard, the Foreign Ministry has expressly stated that we continue to monitor the developments and lament the large-scale military offensive by the Russian Federation, which is an act of aggression under Resolution 3314 of the General Assembly of the United Nations, in violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And as it has been said, and as other distinguished permanent representatives who spoke before me have stated when they've taken the floor, what is happening, in addition to being an act of war, is also violation, a specific violation of human rights. Most of our member countries have our nationals living in Ukraine, from Argentina, from Chile rather, from Ecuador, from others. We also have a significant community in Ukraine. Today at 6 p.m., in a few hours, President Castillo is going to send out a military plane. We don't know if it will be able to reach Kyiv, with the intent of having our fellow nationals come back home. And we want to ensure that we're doing everything we can in contributing to keeping others safe, to ensuring that the other fellow nationals from other member countries are also safe. Also, and I say this constructively, Peru is calling for the initiation of consultations and negotiations for a diplomatic and negotiated and peaceful solution in line with the obligations in the Charter of the United Nations, which are all, might I remind everyone, binding for all member countries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we have Paraguay. You have the floor.
Señor presidente, en atención a la convocatoria de la presente sesión, a continuación procederé a dar lectura del comunicado emitido el día de ayer del Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores del Paraguay en relación con el tema.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to read a statement here. The Republic of Paraguay condemns the assault on the Ukrainian people, which is a violation of the principle of sovereignty and international law. We also urge for the ceasing of hostilities and ask those responsible to come back to negotiations and dialogue in order to find a mutually acceptable and peaceful solution. Our republic calls on the parties to find a solution to their differences within the multilateral system and also urges the Security Council, and particularly the permanent members, to uphold their obligation to maintain peace and security around the world. Also, we would like to reiterate my delegation's position to endorse the declaration as read by Guatemala on behalf of over 20 countries. Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we have Belize. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Belize is very grateful for convening this special meeting and is very happy to see the support for this declaration. I would like to take this opportunity to read a small statement made by the government of Belize on the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine. Belize strongly condemns Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant breach of international law and of its obligations under the United Nations Charter. It also constitutes an unacceptable violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Belize calls for an immediate cease of hostilities, withdrawal of all Russian troops and military hardware from Ukraine, and urges all sides to exercise restraint. Belize stands in solidarity with Ukraine and its people who are enduring the horror of war. Thank you, Chair.
You're very welcome, sir. Next, we have Guyana. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Secretary General ASG Mendez. Please allow me to read a statement from the government of Guyana. The government of Guyana deplores the threat or use of force in the conduct of international relations and urges a peaceful resolution to the differences that currently exist in consonance with the rule of international law and the provisions of the United Nations Charter. The current military action in Ukraine is contrary to the principles of respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and a non-interference in internal affairs of another sovereign state. The aggression against Ukraine is a threat to the region and countries everywhere. The government of Ghana supports the efforts by the UNSG to bring a speedy resolution to the situation in Ukraine and seize the threat to international peace and security. The government of Ghana fully aligns itself with the statements issued by CARICOM on the 14th of February and the 24th of February 2022. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to read that statement.
You're most welcome, sir. Next, we have Venezuela. You have the floor, sir.
Muchas gracias, presidente, señor secretario general adjunto. La invasión ordenada por el presidente de la Federación Rusa, Vladimir.
The invasion ordered by President Putin to Ukraine has, as everyone has noted, been tantamount to a violation of international law and totally contrary to the principles of sovereignty and free determination of peoples, which are cornerstones of the Venezuelan Constitution. We totally subscribe to the declaration that the distinguished ambassador for Guatemala read on behalf of many of us, and we categorically reject this invasion. We can only refer to the public declaration of Maduro on the subject, which, of course, flipped things around and spoke of Russia as the victim rather than the aggressor. We affirm completely, of course, that Mr. Maduro is not Venezuela, nor does he, though he presumes to do so, represent the views of my country and my fellow citizens. For years, he has been, in fact, applauding the increasing presence of the Russian presence in Venezuela, and also the presence of special forces of that country that are very much involved in the illicit trafficking of any number of substances. We know that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia pointed out the view of Mr. Putin to increase his presence in our country, which, of course, were it to happen, to be a flagrant violation of Article 13 of the Constitution of the Republic of Venezuela, where it is clearly established that the country encompasses a zone of peace, which in no way could brook the presence of any foreign power or plenipotentiary. So we speak on behalf of the heroic resistance of the people of Ukraine and hope that the efforts of the international community, including that of His Holiness Pope Francis, will lead us to a good place. And we subscribe to the declaration that has been read out on our behalf. Thank you, sir.
Next, we have the representative from Chile. Ambassador Court, you have the floor, sir.
Embajador, lo escuchamos muy bajo.
Señoras y señores embajadores y embajadores de Estado observadores.
Ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, Chile resolutely condemns the invasion of Russia of Ukraine, despite the myriad calls of the International Committee to observe Article 2 of the United Nations. We call on Russia to withdraw its troops, to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, and to respect the Geneva Conventions as it seeks to spare human life. We fear an increasing escalation of this event, which can only represent a further threat to international peace. We are concerned by the well-being of the Chileans, our citizens who are in the zone of conflict, and therefore we call out for peace. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My country has been very closely following the development of events in Ukraine over the last hours and, dare I say, the last days. Dr. Luis Lacalle Pou, His Excellency, the President of my country, has spoken of this in terms of an offensive against Ukraine. Uruguay is a country of peace. We bet on peace, we believe in peace, and we deeply hold the truth that it's the only way to go. This, of course, is a violation of international public law and the various texts of the United Nations. We know that, and we're all familiar with these enshrined texts. But beyond that, let us say we're deeply moved and mobilized by what is happening. We are grieved by these events. And that is why the sooner we can get out of this predicament, the better. We hope that the matter can be resolved in a civilized manner. We must recall that the overriding principles to which we hold is, among others, the duty to abstain from upholding a violation of peace through the use of force. Let us also remember the UN Resolution 2202 of 2015, the Minsk agreements, wherein a respect for the sovereignty and the integrity of the Ukraine must be observed. And on these bases, then, sir, Uruguay would simply say that it is not only a principle, but it is a sacred duty, really, to speak for working for peace. And we say again, it is essential for international well-being and the development of friendly and profitable relations. We must turn away from the siren call to anywhere and any path that leads but to peace. And so we call out for the very strict observance of international law. And we reject wholeheartedly any sort of measure or action that would go counter to it. And last, sir, let me simply state that we are deeply, deeply grieved, I say again, at the number of innocent victims that have already fallen, the dead that are already adding up. This weighs on us. We are truly, truly bereaved. And as Gandhi was wont to say, there is no road to peace. Peace is the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for coordinating this vital session of the Permanent Council as the situation in Ukraine rapidly evolves. I also want to thank the permanent missions of Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda for bringing this declaration to the attention of the Permanent Council and allowing us to express our support for the people of Ukraine. It's no accident that I am wearing yellow and blue today. I want to start by saying that our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Ukraine as they struggle to maintain their sovereignty and their national identity in the face of Russian aggression. Putin's attack was premeditated, it was unprovoked, and it is absolutely unjustified. As President Biden said, and I quote, President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, unquote. We, as a democratic hemisphere, must stand united against Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, and we must continue to condemn it in the strongest possible terms. Russia's actions are a violation of international law and of the global norms that we, as the international community, have all pledged to respect. Let us be clear. As we witness a large-scale land war in Europe, For the first time since World War II, Russia is the sole aggressor in this crisis. After months of relentless military buildup on Ukraine's borders and hybrid attacks to destabilize Ukraine from within, Russia followed exactly the script that we expected. Putin's illegal recognition of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic represented a farcical pretext for naked aggression, the likes of which we have not seen in Europe in many decades. Well, we have a message from Mr. Putin. This is not 1822, and it's not 1922. The age of imperialism is long gone. Ukraine is a free, sovereign, and independent state, and the Ukrainian nation will continue to exist regardless of Putin's efforts to crush it. The consequences of Russia's aggressions will be felt for years to come. Ukrainians will fight for their country just as you or I would fight for our own, regardless of the odds. Ukraine will not give up its sovereignty without a fight, nor should it. Regardless of who eventually comes out on top, there will be death and destruction on a massive scale. Russia, and Russia alone, must be held responsible for this tragedy. Ukraine's neighbors will face a humanitarian emergency as refugees pour across their borders. International peace and security will be jeopardized and the global economy weakened. The implications of Russia's decision to launch a war of conquest against its peaceful neighbor will reverberate globally, affecting us all, including those in our hemisphere, for years to come. We urge all countries in the hemisphere to join us in strongly and publicly condemning Russia's aggression and affirming our support for Ukraine. We ask that you call on Russia through every possible channel to cease its hostilities. In closing, we must remain united in our message to Russia. The territory of a sovereign state cannot be seized by force of arms. Borders cannot be redrawn at gunpoint. Russia's military aggression is illegal and unacceptable to the civilized world. We call on all democratic countries to press Russia to halt its military operations in Ukraine immediately, return its troops and equipment to Russia, and cease all further aggression against Ukraine, including its ongoing cyber attacks. We look forward to working with other OAS member states to uphold the values of the international system and support a return to the status quo ante. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Permit me to make a slight change to the ordinary ranking of presenters to recognize first the representatives for the OAS member states, and then we'll move on to the observer states. So next in line would be in order, Jamaica, Suriname, Bolivia, and Brazil, and after those four, we'll then go to the observers. So next we have Jamaica. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Ambassadors, Alternates, good afternoon. Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this meeting. I also thank the delegations of Antigua and Barbuda and Guatemala for their diligence in ensuring that this issue is brought front and center to this permanent council. Mr. Chairman, kindly permit me to read into the records the statement issued by Jamaica on Russia's military action. Before I do, please add Jamaica to the list of co-sponsors of this very important declaration. I quote, Jamaica strongly condemns the military action by Russia against Ukraine. We are deeply concerned by the escalation of violence and condemn the clear violation of the United Nations Charter, particularly the obligation to respect the sovereign rights and the territorial integrity of states. As members of the United Nations, we have all committed to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war that has often brought untold sorrow to mankind. The ongoing incursions in Ukraine are a violation of that sacred promise. Jamaica strongly urges Russia to cease all acts of aggression and to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. We also call for a return to diplomatic channels to continue engagement until there is a bridge of common understanding that will lead to peace. Jamaica shares the hope that an escalation of war and further bloodshed can be avoided. We join other peace-loving nations in calling for a cessation of hostilities and for the immediate return to open dialogue, mutual understanding, and respect for the rights of sovereign nations. The military conflict has grave implications for all of us and must end without further delay. End of quote. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're very welcome, sir. Next we go to Suriname. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, good afternoon. This delegation takes this opportunity to read into the records a press communique issued on February 24, 2022 by the government of Suriname on the situation in Ukraine. Quote, "The Republic of Suriname strongly condemns the Russian military intervention in Ukraine. The Republic of Suriname noted with great concern the Russian military invasion of Ukraine and hereby expresses its condemnation for this military aggression. Suriname supports the guiding principles of international law as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, and in this context underlines the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. The Russian invasion of a sovereign and independent country can be accepted under any circumstances. This invasion will have far-reaching consequences for the people of Ukraine and pose a serious threat to peace and security in the region and the world. In this regard, the government of the Republic of Suriname wishes to reiterate its principal position regarding peaceful coexistence and restoring dialogue in any existing conflict, regardless of its nature, upholding international accepted principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of states, non-intervention, respect for sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states. In this regard, Suriname agrees with the CARICOM position, which states that all parties involved are called upon to act responsibly and with self-control to avoid destabilization in that region. The Republic of Suriname maintains diplomatic and friendly ties with Russia and Ukraine and will under all circumstances remain committed to processes of dialogue and diplomacy as essential elements to contribute to democracy, peace, stability, and security." Unquote. Thank you, Chair.
You're very welcome. We next turn to Bolivia. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente, señor secretario general adjunto, distinguidos embajadores. El Estado plurinacional de Bolivia, ante la grave situación presentada con el conflicto.
Our country, given the very serious situation, and as we saw in the declaration issued by the Foreign Ministry yesterday, we express our deep and profound concern and bemoans the situation that involves two sovereign countries being in this conflict. Bolivia is a peaceful country that believes that the only way forward is the peaceful dispute of settlements through diplomacy and dialogue and entente between nations and peoples of the world. Bolivia believes that every life matters and that nothing Absolutely nothing justifies any form of violence or aggression when those who pay the price are people. Every life lost in a military conflict, be it national or external, is a person who's lost their lives, a family destroyed, and an affront to all of us as part of the human race. This is why, remembering the very painful experience of the 2 world wars and other very serious conflicts in the 20th century alone, we do not agree with any armed aggression. We reject it, especially because we support life. Therefore, we call for the immediate cessation of the use of arms. We also call for the return to negotiations and also advocate for the parties around the table to get rid of all kind of partial or specific interests and put at the heart of the negotiations the right that everyone has to self-determination and to maintaining their territory's integrity. Bolivia also calls for peace and exalts all parties to find a political solution under international law, and particularly under the aegis of the UN, which is the only multilateral organization that has the power to intervene in these kinds of situations. And we call on all parties to adhere to international law and also to the legal, peaceful settlement of dispute mechanisms. Mr. Chairman, ambassadors, Bolivia, as a pacifist country, reiterates before this forum once again the defense of the idea that people should live in peace, that people should have their lives safeguarded, their respect for international law, and also for human rights, which have been universally adopted. Mr. Chairman, Bolivia also expresses its hope that, above all, what is respected is the right to life for civilians, men, women, and children, and also urges for all parties involved to act immediately and to do it in the best interest of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like now to turn to Brazil. You have the floor, sir.
Ok. Obrigado, senhor presidente. Na condição de membro não permanente, o Brasil.
In its condition of a member here, we are also, I want to say, a member of the Security Council of the United Nations, not a permanent member of the Security Council, but we are there. And Brazil is gravely concerned by the incursion, the invasion of Russia into Ukrainian territory. And we join forces in echoing the general call for a peaceful resolution to this situation. There has to be another way other than to send troops into the disputed territory. It is also true that the grave concerns over security that the Russian Federation has pointed to over the last years must also be taken into account, including the accumulation of strategic arms in the European theater. But that is not a green light to use force and to make incursions into a free territory. The UN offers the ideal forum to discuss these issues deeply and completely. Brazil is committed to the measures that will achieve an immediate ceasefire and restore peace and security in the region. That is our primary objective. All our efforts are concentrated also on avoiding a humanitarian calamity. And we see this coming with the onslaught of increasing numbers of refugees. The lives of these individuals, including the most vulnerable, must be uppermost in our minds at this moment. So we make another call for the complete cessation of hostility and the immediate return to diplomatic dialogue. There is no alternative to resolve such crises as these. And, sir, our system of collective security at the end of the day hinges on our respect for international law and the principles of not only our own charter, but certainly that of the United Nations. We believe that the maintenance and preservation of peace are also beautifully enshrined, I say, in our own charter of Organization of American States. But in Article 1 of our charter, we see it set forth very bluntly. We need to marshal the necessary principles to uphold peace and hemispheric security, to avoid possible reasons for difficulties, and to move to the peaceful resolution of controversies amongst members. Those are the three key parts to our commitment here under our charter, with a view to arriving at a more peaceful settlement that will settle the crises or changes of opinion of the member states. Among other principles, we need to understand that the rule of law, international order, boils down to a respect for the individuality and the sovereignty of member states. And there are obligations that flow from treaties and other instruments of international law, as we all know. The Organization of American States resolutely condemns this act of war, and where there are one or more disputes among American entities, we know that the road given is a peaceful solution. We see a role for us in attempting to resolve other similar conflicts elsewhere, and this we are doing now. But direct negotiation, mediation, judicial mediation, I should say, and arbitration are but a few other instruments that can be brought to the attention of the parties in conflict. Multidimensional security and integral development, our own peace and security, all of those enshrined in our own columns are important to peace itself. Thank you.
Second. Next, we have Honduras.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Honduras wishes to also express our adherence to this declaration. And I would also like to read out the latest press release from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Honduras reiterates our condemnation to the use of force and military actions in Ukraine. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Honduras expresses its deep concern given the Russian military operation in Ukraine and calls for the return to the respect for international principles, which are the very essence of peaceful coexistence between countries. We also fully and firmly reject the use of force that leads to an armed escalation and a deterioration of the situation in Ukraine. We reiterate our call for a political way out of this crisis and ask for participation in UN broker dialogue in order to find peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have the Bahamas.
Thank you, Chair. My delegation wishes to express its gratitude to Antigua and Barbuda, to Guatemala, and to all the delegations who joined in the calling of this very important meeting. We would like to read into the record a statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Bahamas, the Honorable Frederick Mitchell, issued on the 24th of February. The invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation and led by its President Vladimir Putin is wrong, unlawful, and should end and be reversed. We support the statements of the Secretary General of the United Nations. We have also joined with our CARICOM partners in support of a joint statement on this issue. The Bahamas supports the right of self-determination, the inviolability of territory settled within legally defined borders. The seizure of territories based on tendentious interpretations of history should not be the basis for hegemony over other nations and peoples without their consent. We again call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and for the Russians to withdraw to their borders. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the Bahamas wishes to add its name to the list of co-sponsors of the declaration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to turn next to Argentina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My delegation is going to read the statement issued by the Foreign Ministry of Argentina, dated yesterday, February 24th, 2022. The Republic of Argentina, in adherence with the most essential principles of the international community, rejects firmly the use of armed force and also profoundly condemns the escalation of the situation in Ukraine. The most lasting solutions are only achieved through dialogue and mutual commitment that ensure peaceful coexistence. This is why we call on the Federation of Russia to cease all hostilities. We also reiterate our full adherence for all of the principles in the Charter of the United Nations, with no prominence given to any one over another, and believe that all states have the right to the respect for their sovereignty and their territorial integrity. We believe that all of the mechanisms we have in our arsenal as the international community for dialogue should be used. The intensification of the situation makes it very difficult to save lives, and it's important for all actors to be prudent in their actions and to ensure that peace is guaranteed for all nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, again, we'd like to make a slight change now. We're ready to move to the observers, but I think we should be responsive to the requests that came in earlier. So first, I'd like to ask Ukraine to present, followed by France, and then followed by Russia. Thereafter, we will go to the remaining observers who have not yet presented. So next, Ukraine, you have the floor, please.
Dear esteemed Mr. President, dear friends of the Permanent Council, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this podium. We're very grateful for the missions of Antigua and Barbuda, Guatemala, Barbados, Belize, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Grenada, Guyana, Dominican Republic, and the United States for convening this session. On February 24, 2022, a new war, a full-scale armed conflict, started in the very heart of Europe, and it started because Russia launched this war on Ukraine. Aggressor state crossed Ukraine's border from Russia, from Belarus, and launched missiles on the peaceful cities of Ukraine, attacked with aviation, tanks, and artillery, sent subversion and reconnaissance groups into our country. In response, Ukraine has activated its right for self-defense, according to Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. And we will defend our homes, and we will defend every inch of our land and every person that now is under attack from the army and armed forces of the Russian Federation. Shelling and fighting continue along the state border with Russia and Belarus. Shelling continues in Donbass along administrative boundaries of the temporary occupied territory of Crimea. And again, I want to say that even though this full-fledged war started now, but Russia attacked us in 2014, and Russia illegally occupied Crimea and illegally occupied parts of Donetsk and Lugansk, starting from 2014. Thousands of Ukrainian citizens already joined the territorial defense forces of Ukraine. Our very motivated armed forces, territorial defense, and every citizen essentially resist now and protect their homes. As we speak now, there is ongoing airstrikes on Kiev. And it's hard to imagine that something like this happens in the center of Europe in the 21st century. On 24th of February, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine approved President Zelensky's decision to impose the martial law on the entire territory of Ukraine for the period of 30 days with the aim to ensure Ukraine's defense, public safety, and state interest. A curfew was introduced in some Ukrainian cities, including Kiev. We have cut off our diplomatic relations with Russia. The second day, which is today, brought even more suffering and losses. Air raids, tanks, rocket shelling, all of that continued. Again, 75 years after the World War II, Ukrainians and our fearless armed forces again see on our streets and in our villages what we only remember from movies now from the World War II. And again, in this century, we have to fight for our own country. So fighting continues not only in Kiev, as I said, but also in Cherkasy, in Chernihiv, in Mariupol, in Kherson, in Kharkiv, and other cities of Ukraine. So we are fighting with the help of our friends and allies. We request all of our friends and allies to impose massive and strong sanctions to show and send a clear message that this behavior and this brutal attack on a sovereign country is not something that can be tolerated in the 21st century. We also ask for more defensive weapons so that our armed forces can sustain the effort and continue defending our citizens. And we also ask all the international organizations to also suspend participation of Russian Federation in the bodies, because it's only peace-loving countries and countries who do not attack others that should be able to participate in them. So we already are thankful to the US, Canada, UK, EU, Australia, and New Zealand for the introduction of the sectoral sanctions. We are welcoming the decision of the Council of Europe to expel Russia, which was taken today. We deem it unacceptable to maintain diplomatic relations with the aggressor state, and therefore we also, ask everyone to consider severing the diplomatic states. Today, small island state, Micronesia, decided to sever diplomatic relations with Russia. And we think it's an excellent example which shows that values and principles matter to all of us. So we are very grateful for CARICOM statement issued on February 21st. Thank you for that statement as a very clear statement and condemning the Russian war, and also the statement issued by Jamaica. The international organizations might consider, as I said, banning Russia's membership. And we urge the General Assembly of the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States to ban the permanent observer status of Russia in this organization. This move will not only help Ukraine, because it's not about Ukraine. It's about the question whether international rule of law still works and whether we collectively can defend all of us, essentially, if somebody decides to attack us for no reason at all. In these challenging times, I would like to thank you for all the individual messages of support that I'm getting. And I know the support that your people are sending to the people of Ukraine. Thank you very much for praying for us. We pray for peace, but we demand justice at this point in time. And again, I want to say that all Ukrainians, all of us, are very set on defending our country. Thank you very much for your attention.
You're most welcome. In response to a pre-booking request, we'd like to turn next to France. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering if perhaps it would be more appropriate to offer the floor to Russia, and then I can come back and take the floor before my European colleagues take the floor.
I would be pleased to do that. Russia is next in line. You have the floor, Russia.
Merci beaucoup. Et je prendrai la parole juste après.
Thank you very much. I shall follow after.
The delegation of Russia, could you please request the floor again? I think they have technical problem. Let's see, try again. No, it's not going into the room. No, maybe you can connect through your cell phone with the app, or maybe try to close all other video conference software that you have open. Now you are. Thank you.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, we take note of misinterpretation of the situation in Ukraine and unfounded accusations against the Russian Federation. In the declaration read today on behalf of several member states, it has been ignored that a bloody war with civilian casualties has been waged in Donbass for long 8 years. During this period, people have been suffering from abuse and genocide by the Kiev regime. According to Russia's investigative committee, more than 2,600 civilians died in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics over the past 8 years, and another 5,500 were wounded. We would like to remind you that President Zelensky demanded everyone who considers himself Russian, close to Russian culture or the Russian language, to get out from Ukraine to the Russian Federation. All the time, our Western colleagues were consistently covering up for the Ukrainian regime, turning a blind eye on military crimes against civilians. The West fully supported the Kiev regime in its attempts to sabotage and destroy Minsk agreements. NATO and the EU defended the Kiev regime in the recent weeks when it definitely decided to solve the Donbass problem by force, declared that the accession to NATO has no alternatives, and started threatening with acquiring nuclear weapons. Massive saturation of Ukraine with modern weapons by the West and militarization of Ukrainian territory left us with no choice but to implement the announced measures. President Vladimir Putin made the decision to carry out a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. This decision was made in accordance with the UN Charter and the treaties of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Russian Federation could not remain indifferent to the direct requests from the heads of the states for military aid in the face of aggression. The special operation, which started on February 24th, is not a beginning of a conflict, but an end to the 8-year bloody war. Actions by the Russian armed forces are not aimed against a peaceful population. We're open to diplomacy. However, diplomacy presumes an ability to negotiate. It is not a tool for blackmailing and imposing the decisions that Washington and its satellites need. Thank you.
Thank you. We revert now to France. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, colleagues. Europe, once again, is a scene of extremely severe situations that are bringing us back to these darkest times in our history. The United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the European Union have obviously taken steps given this sudden challenging of the international order and attack against dialogue and diplomacy and the principles of the international community. France is a president of the European Union and has been working closely with the presidents of the European Council as well as other colleagues. And the European Council met yesterday and condemned in the strongest terms this aggression that was unprovoked, that is unjustified. And alongside its partners from the European Union, France also condemned in the strongest terms this assault by Russia on Ukraine. This is a decision that is a flagrant violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, as well as of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. We call on Russia to immediately cease its military operations and ask that they withdraw from Ukraine. We call for the respect of humanitarian law and respect for the rights of the civilians, the vulnerable communities, women, children, the elderly, as well as humanitarian workers. We are going to hold Russia responsible for any consequences stemming from this aggression. Mr. Chairman, the international community needs to show that we can come together in condemning this aggression and call for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of Russian troops, as well as for the respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, including in the 2 annexed territories within internationally recognized borders. That is our message as France right now, the message we're delivering at the Security Council of the United Nations at this moment. That is our obligation as permanent members. In response to this destabilization strategy and confrontation paths chosen by Russia, we ask for the international community to come together, to stand up for these fundamental principles of international law and of the UN Charter, which are also the principles enshrined in the Charter of the Organization of American States. France, alongside our European partners, laments the already too high number of people who have died and the plight and the human tragedy that have resulted from this aggression. We reassure Ukraine that we stand with the country in the face of this situation, which calls for a firm and strong reaction from all democracy-loving, international law-abiding countries and organizations such as this one. We'll continue to help politically and humanitarian, logistically and financially and diplomatic Ukrainians. And we thank you for this opportunity.
Most welcome, sir. Next we have in line Italy. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, ambassadors. Firstly, I would like to thank France for its intervention as presidency of the European Union. As explained by the Ambassador of France, the European Union is united in the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that we have strongly condemned. Our union is stronger than ever as we face a crisis in Europe that entails defending so close to our common border the principles that are at the core of the international rules-based order. The same principles, along with many common values that we share with the member states of the OAS, who we thank for calling this very important Permanent Council meeting today and for the declaration they adopted. As member states, as European Union member states, we have called for a united international reaction because, as we have all witnessed, Russia started a military offensive in Ukraine, a European country, a nation that is a friend, a democracy struck in its very own legitimate sovereignty and in a breach of international law. As the Prime Minister of Italy, Mario Draghi, has stated, Ukraine has the full and unconditional solidarity of the Italian people and our government, because what happens in Ukraine concerns all of us, our lives as free people, our democracies. Italy, the European Union, all our allies have called on Russia to put an immediate end to the attack and to unconditionally withdraw its military forces from the international recognized borders of Ukraine. Both in the G7 and in the European Council, Italy has coordinated a strong sanctions package. We are also very active at the United Nations, and with our NATO allies, we are working to enhance security measures on the alliance's eastern flank in all the most directly exposed allied countries. In all contexts, the government of Italy intends to work tirelessly to help solve this crisis in close coordination with our allies and friends. As Prime Minister Draghi also stated, together we will do everything it takes to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, Europe's security, and the integrity of the international rules-based order and values we all share. Thank you.
You're most welcome, sir. Next, we have the Holy See. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General. The Holy See has been monitoring this very profoundly concerning situation in Ukraine. Pope Francis has expressed his dismay, his anguish, and his concern for this situation. He also calls on all involved parties to abstain from anything that could inflict even more pain on the populations and could destabilize nations and continue to undermine international law. The Holy See, through His Eminence Cardinal Parolin, Secretary of State, believes that there is still time to reflect goodwill. There is still room for negotiation. And there's still an opportunity to exercise a kind of wisdom that can leave out all specific interests and can protect the legitimate aspirations of all parties and can prevent the world from experiencing the horrors of war. In this regard, the Holy See laments the terrible developments and calls on any party in this hemisphere as well to continue raising its diplomatic voice to help solve this conflict. We also would like to extend an invitation from Pope Francis for those who believe and those who don't to come together as part of a day of reflection and also for a time of fast on March 2nd in order to ask for peace to reign on Ukraine and on the entire world. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Next, we have Spain. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias. En nombre de España quiero expresar la condena en los términos más.
Thank you very much. Let me, on behalf of Spain, take the floor to express an absolute condemnation in the most specific and unwavering terms of this incursion of Russia into Ukraine. This is a violation of the precepts of the Charter of the United Nations and every other principle of peace and stability in Europe. Through this action, the entire international community has been put at risk. And since it has been properly said here several times, sir, this afternoon, the principles of the Charter of the Organization of American States are abundantly clear. Therein, we respect the principles of respect for the sovereignty and independence of states, and as such, the American states rise up as one entity to condemn this war of aggression, admitting that it implies, as I've mentioned, an undeniable international dimension. Spain certainly is always in favor of a diplomatic negotiation for peace, but we have seen ourselves obliged, and convincingly so, to join our European counterparts as one to speak against the aggression against Ukraine and to impose measures as a result of it. Russia has to understand that the international community will not sit idly by and let this happen. We therefore urge every one of the American states or present here also to go public on its condemnation of this international aggression, such as is happening as I speak in the Security Council of the UN. We must as one rise up against the contravention of the most basic principles of international comity that are the bedrock of this organization as well. And finally, let me express my profound and unstinting support for the people of Ukraine, for the civilian population, and for my own co-citizens who are there and who, with the help of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are making their way home. We bemoan the increasing loss of human life. So we speak here for unity and for unwavering commitment for peace on behalf of Spain and the European Union. Thank you.
Floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Quisiera agradecer y felicitar en primer lugar a los países que han impulsado esta iniciativa importantísima. Estos son días tristes, como no hemos visto.
Let me, Chair, thank you for taking the initiative to convene this most important meeting to ponder days that we had all desperately hoped we would never have to see again. Switzerland rises up and condemns the military invasion of Russia into the territory of Ukraine.
Possible terms. Prosigo en español. Suiza pide a Rusia que desescale la situación inmediatamente, cesen todas las hostilidades y retiren sus tropas del territorio ucraniano sin demora ninguna.
Switzerland also calls for an immediate withdrawal of troops. We are appalled at the outrageous use of and abuse of power and the invasion against Ukraine, which is contrary to the most basic principles of international law. We condemn the military use by Russia. The military use by Russia against Ukraine is a tremendous threat to security throughout the European continent and the world at large, and this worries us deeply. we call out on the Russian Federation to respect the principles of international law, to respect the rules that protect civilians and civilian objects, including health installations, per established international law. Switzerland is certainly willing to offer its good offices to try to de-escalate and to end this conflict. Thank you very much.
You have the floor, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair of the Permanent Council, Your Excellency, Secretary General Almagro, Assistant Secretary General Menendez, and distinguished permanent representatives and fellow permanent observers. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to address this special session of the Permanent Council to consider the situation in Ukraine. Let me also thank the permanent missions of Guatemala and Antigua and Barbuda, for requesting this meeting, as well as their co-sponsors. Let me begin by reaffirming the statement of the European Council's meeting in Brussels yesterday, at which all 27 EU member states, heads of state and government condemned in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprecedented military aggression against Ukraine, an independent and sovereign state. By its illegal military actions, Russia is grossly and flagrantly violating international law, the principles of the UN Charter, and undermining European and global security and stability. This includes the right of Ukraine to choose its own destiny. Russia bears full responsibility for this act of aggression and all the destruction and loss of life it will cause, it has caused, it will cause, and it will be held accountable. The European Union demands that Russia immediately ceases its military actions, unconditionally withdraws all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, and fully respects Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. We also call on Russia to respect international humanitarian law and stop their disinformation campaign and cyber attacks. The European Union deplores the tragic loss of life and human suffering caused by the Russian aggression. We stand united in our solidarity with the Ukrainian women, men and children whose lives have been affected by this unjustified and unjustifiable attack. We will continue to support Ukraine and its people together with its international partners, including through additional political, financial, humanitarian and logistical support and an international donors conference. The European Union also strongly condemns the involvement of Belarus in this aggression against Ukraine. The EU has reacted swiftly and decisively to Russia's recognition of Ukraine's self-proclaimed separatist entities and deployment of its armed forces by adopting a whole raft of restrictive measures in response. These sanctions, taken in close coordination with our partners and allies, impose massive and severe consequences on Russia for its action. These sanctions cover many sectors, including financial, energy and transport, as well as export controls, export financing and visas. The European Union reiterates its unwavering support for the independent sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. It calls on all countries not to recognize the two self-proclaimed separatist entities and not to facilitate or in any way assist them. We call on the international community to demand from Russia the immediate end of this aggression, which endangers international peace and security on a global scale. We count on your support to condemn Russia's actions and to voice your support in all relevant fora to the founding principles of international law and the international rules-based order that have been violated by the Russian Federation. The European Union firmly believes that the use of force and coercion to change borders has no place in the 21st century. Tensions and conflicts should be resolved exclusively through dialogue and diplomacy. The European Union will continue cooperating closely with neighbours, partners and allies within the multilateral context, as well as around the globe. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome, sir. We next turn to Portugal. You have the floor, please.
Portugal very much thanks you, Chair, for convening this important meeting as several permanent members have requested. We vehemently condemn this unjustified military incursion into Ukraine. Innocent citizens whose liberty and freedoms are being flagrantly violated in violation of the basic principles of the Charter of the OAS, and which is so jeopardizing the stability and peace not only in Europe but of the world at large. We also grievously regret the loss of life, and to that end we're very grateful, yes, to see the representation of Russia who is here, but we call upon the Russian representative to ensure that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine can be restored, and that Russia's personnel and hardware should be removed. For all these reasons, inter alia, we join the Secretary General Paulo Guterres in our call and in his unequivocal call to diplomatic dialogue. As a member of the European Union, let me also say that Portugal very warmly supports the statements made by France and the representative of the European Union. We are very pleased for this presentation to the Permanent Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Secretary General Almagro, Assistant Secretary General Mendez, ambassadors and observers. Yesterday morning, the world was truly shocked by an unwarranted, unprovoked, and illegal attack by Russia on Ukraine. The Kingdom of the Netherlands condemns this act of war in the strongest possible terms. This is a massive attack on a sovereign and independent state and is unprecedented in recent European history. It is also an illegal and unacceptable act. As others have said, Russia and Russia alone is responsible for the bloodshed in Ukraine. Russia's military invasion is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter. Russia is a signatory to this charter, and yet Russia now chooses to disregard and damage the pillars of international law and the international security architecture. Needless to say, this goes against every Russian commitment and obligation. In the past weeks, Russia has deceived the international community and its own population by deliberately spreading false information. It ignored the diplomatic and confidence-building measures that were put in place in recent years. Russia needs to cease its military action immediately, completely, and unconditionally. It must withdraw all its troops from Ukrainian territory and seek a diplomatic solution. To our Ukrainian friends and partners, the Kingdom of the Netherlands wants to assure you that we stand with you in the darkest hour. We stand in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We expect the UN General Assembly to be seized with a resolution condemning Russia's breach of the UN Charter. I urge every OAS member state to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Next, we turn to Germany. You have the floor.
Distinguished Chair of the Permanent Council, Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, distinguished permanent representatives and permanent observers. The Russian attack on Ukraine is a breach of the UN Charter that is unprecedented since its entry into force. Russia does not even pretend to act in line with international law. It explicitly announces the aims of its aggression: to demilitarize a sovereign state and replace its democratically elected government. UN Secretary General Guterres has condemned this breach of the UN Charter in clear words and asked Russia to stop the attack and withdraw from the Ukraine. He has made clear that this is a global crisis that affects every UN member state. We also condemn the involvement of Belarus in this aggression against Ukraine and call on it to abide by its international obligations. Germany, its allies and partners stand in solidarity with Ukraine its sovereign equality, and territorial integrity. Russian aggression will have an unprecedented price for Russia, politically and economically. Russia's reputation and standing in the world stands in ruin. It is in every state's interest to speak up now, to stand by Ukraine, to stand by the UN Charter. Therefore, what we need now is a clear and unanimous condemnation of this attack by all UN member states in order to isolate Russia in the light of its military aggression. We need to stand by Ukraine and reiterate our unwavering commitment to the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders and by the UN Charter. We therefore ask you to not recognize the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and to publicly condemn this unilateral and isolated decision made by Russia in the OAS, as well as in national statements, in other international organizations and alliances. We expect the UN General Assembly to be seized with a resolution condemning Russia's breach of the UN Charter, and we urge every OAS member state to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. We return now to Ukraine. You have the floor.
Very much, and thank you for allowing me to speak again. I just wanted to say how painful it was for me to listen to my colleague from Russian Federation in day when they have hit an orphanage, hospital, civilian infrastructure, when they have taken under control the Chernobyl station, and when they are shelling at regular residences of people. That's why our prosecutor general is actually collecting all these videos, all the photos, and we were preparing to hold them accountable also in the International Court of Law. And we will have witnesses there because we have quite a number of Russian soldiers who surrendered. And we have also their audio statements who say that they did not know where they were going, they did not have an intent, but they were made to go to kill Ukrainians. So again, I just want to reiterate that Ukraine is a very peaceful country. We never attacked anyone. It was Ukraine that was attacked in 2014 by Russia. It was Ukraine that lost Crimea after that attack and parts of Donetsk and Lugansk. We never planned any offenses on Donetsk and Lugansk. We actually, for 8 years, tried to find a diplomatic solution. And as a result, we only received this recent brutal attack and violation of the international law. And for the past 48 hours, our brave men and women are fighting for the existence of our country. They're fighting for life of every Ukrainian. So I would like to thank everyone here, all the distinguished members of the CARICOM. Thank you, dear friends, and all the observers, all the European colleagues, and the United States of America. Thank you very much for your words of support and for the acts of support. We have to stop it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'd like to turn to the Secretary General, Luis Almagro, for closing remarks. You have the chair, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Desde la Secretaría General de la Organización de los Estados Americanos condenamos en los más duros términos la invasión de la Federación Rusa a Ucrania y llamamos a un inmediato
most stringent terms, the Organization of American States condemns the Russian invasion of the Ukraine and call for an immediate withdrawal. This is a crime against international peace that has been perpetrated by Russia against the citizenry of the Ukraines and a violation of international law. There is no justification whatsoever for this egregious act. Not a single justification. The United Nations and the same standards and norms that are the framework of the Organization of American States both condemn unilaterally this type of action. This is a mention of illegal conflict that was enshrined back in 1945 in the Charter of the UN. The very framework of international law absolutely speaks to the need to avoid any military act or mode of action incompatible with peace. We condemn this war of aggression in the territory of a state that is now militarily occupied, taken by force by another state, and that is contrary in any context, even be it temporarily, contrary to the basic principles of international law. It is indeed that violation of international law, which is essential to international comity, that has given rise to an end to what has been likely one of the longest periods of peace and prosperity in the continent. The 1970 Statement of Principles on International Law, on principles amongst occupying parties, have set forth how this should take place. 4 years later, the General Assembly of the UN in Resolution 1314 that spoke to aggression without being exhaustive, spoke of the acts of aggression that would constitute aggressive act by any military action, be it temporary or the bombarding of a country, that is also against international law. So whatever the excuse, military excuse or other, can possibly be trotted out as a justification. This is in violation of international law. And under the direct guidance of the President of the Russian Federation, crimes against humanity are being carried out. These are not merely conventional norms that are enshrined here and there. These are imperatives of international law that admit of no broach. These are principles that cannot be overlooked in a war of aggression that is without question an assault on international law and on peace and prosperity to the world. This is a criminal act that has been perpetrated by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, and it will trigger the entire panoply of weapons and measures at the disposal of international law. And people will be held personally accountable. Anyone who launches a war of aggression is certainly not free of possible prosecution. I refer you to the Nuremberg trials. There is not just a national crime, but an international crime that can be committed when one crime leads to another set of crimes. This is established law, res judicata. And so wars of aggression of this sort will be judged. There is no possible way to justify such action, particularly when we see the series of aggressions that the Federation has been committing against Ukraine. There is no question that this is an international law. Now, both Ukraine and Russia have been accepted as permanent observers of the OAS, and that imposes on us an obligation to speak up, as it imposes on them an obligation to abide by the rules it purportedly supported. And we condemn this action most resolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, Secretary General Almagro, for those closing remarks. There being no further requests for the floor, we have concluded the order of business for this special meeting. Today's comments will be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. I thank each of you for your participation. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much.